This is
If
pretty
you ever
close.
watch a YouTube Black Hills talking about cybersecurity news, basically you got Jason Blanchard or whoever the guests are on, the six of them. The first part of it, it's really he's quite humorous, where they're all talking about different things. And so let's get right on into it today. I'll introduce our guests momentarily, but just to set the stage, I'm Andrew Morgan. I'm your host.
Andrew Morgan.
Oh, that just did that just repeat itself?
Yeah.
That's weird. All right. So welcome everybody, and thank you for joining. Got one of my all-time favorites here, Beau Bullock, senior pen tester. I think that I'll let you give the exact titles and everything about you, Beau, but really appreciate you coming on for a three-part series, and really excited for you to unveil the latest in your creation of Backdoors Breaches Cloud Edition. This is getting exciting. There's been a lot of expansion decks, but there hasn't been a Cloud Edition. And on the heels of the Verizon data breach report, which we've talked a little bit about here, we've talked about it on the cyber call. We're going to have you on the cyber call Monday. No shock that credentials are where everything is at, right, Jim? Credential theft,
100%.
and web apps, AKA M365 being the most common. And the big takeaway that I put a clip up on LinkedIn was, for the first time in the Verizon data breach report, they do not break out SMB from enterprise. I don't know if you saw that, Beau, but I thought it was really fascinating because the tool sets that the SMB and the enterprise are using are so similar, because there's been such a voracious move to the cloud that they can't delineate enough. There's no deltas enough now to really break it apart. So it's just, here are the compromises, here are the threat actors, here are the tactics, here are the blah blah. So setting the stage, it's a perfect time to have you on. Talk a little bit about yourself, if you would, introduce yourself and set the stage on the latest edition, what you created, and we'll get right into it.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll go ahead and share screen here too. Yeah, so I'm Beau. I work for Black Hills. I've got an about me slide here too. I guess I can just pull that up real quick. So
somebody's
yeah, I get a little reverb, or delay there. Yeah, so I work at Black Hills Information Security. I have been here 9 years. I have run the gamut of different types of penetration testing. So we were actually talking about it earlier, like when I first joined, I started doing physicals, I've done all like different manners of web applications, internals, externals, command and control, assume compromise. And then over the years, that's kind of evolved into me exclusively working on like red team and cloud assessments. So now I pretty much exclusively I'm working pretty much R&D at this point, and taking our cloud assessments at Black Hills. Speaker, I've spoken at a number of conferences. I've written a number of tools. Actually, I'll talk about a couple of them today. A lot of the tools I write tend to be cloud related, for finding vulnerabilities, because I'm more of like the offensive type, right? Yeah, so basically, Andrew asked if I would kind of come on and do like a series of Backdoors and Breaches Cloud Edition. And so if you haven't seen Backdoors and Breaches before, it's an incident response card game it's a way for organizations to kind of go through a process of identifying an attack chain. And it's really neat because you can create these customized attack chains, and they're randomized every single time you play it. And so we ended up making a cloud security version of it that is basically 100% just all the cloud attacks, different types of initial compromise, pivoting. And so what I ended up doing is making 3 different scenarios. So over the next 3 weeks, we're going to go through 3 different scenarios, completely unique scenarios. I kind of, customize these scenarios myself so that they like feel a little bit more like they flow a little better. Yeah, so that's pretty much it. I don't know, Andrew, you want to get into it, or?
Yeah, let's get into it. What I would ask, Beau, just for the audience. So first, thank you all for joining. What makes all Events great is your contribution. So I'll keep an eye on chat. Yeah, we don't have a Q&A because it's not one of those types of Zoom, but I'll keep an eye on chat. If you have questions, can you pop them in there? And because that's what really makes this a lot more enjoyable. I know Beau personally loves that part of it when you guys have questions.
Yes, please.
The other thing is just a why for yes and for no. Have you guys heard of Backdoors and Breaches? Have you used it? Just let's just get a sense there, and then I'll keep an eye out, Beau, kind of what kind of feedback we get. Oh, hey, Joel, awesome to see you, Ryan. Great. Oh,
cool. So we've got a lot of people that have
at
least seen it. Yeah.
Yeah. iPhones
awesome.
used it.
Perfect. So you guys know the game. So it's supposed to be a collaborative thing, right? You're supposed to have input on this.
Yes.
But for the sake of it being like a webinar, like I don't have you guys like rolling dice and stuff through it. So I kind of like crafted the whole thing, right? And we're gonna kind of like flip cards together.
Yeah.
No, feel free to like answer the way that you would answer, or if you have a certain detection that you want to try, throw it out there, and we'll kind of roll that way.
Yeah, Beau, and if you want to roll a virtual dice, and if you guys have like any bourbon at your desk or any other types of paraphernalia, just feel free. We could do it, a virtual scenario there as well. But Jim, you fully endorse that, don't you? All right. Go
100% endorse.
All right, go ahead.
Well, so it's going to get tough because every single roll is going to be successful, and
there you go.
Hope you got a lot of bourbon. All right. So this first scenario is going to be business email compromise. I mean, it's kind of like it's kind of perfect, right? Because we were just talking about that Chinese APT group that Microsoft just reported got access to a key, signed credentials, and started authenticating as multiple organizations. So kind of fits that narrative, right, a little bit. So roadmap wise, basically the way this is going to work is I'm going to explain Backdoors and Breaches, give you a quick like high level overview of what it is. Then we'll do scenario. We'll talk about what like the actual narrative around the scenario is going to be, and then we're going to solve the attack chain, and then we'll talk a little bit about each step of the attack chain. So one thing that I like, and I brought this up to Andrew a while back, and I think that might have kind of spurred this whole series, is I had this idea that I wanted to basically take content from my class and then basically teach sections of my class as we go through the attack chain. So what I ended up doing is, working with Jason and Deb at Black Hills to make this deck purely like almost direct from my class content. And so a lot of the cards directly align to a training course that I wrote called Breaching the Cloud. And so as we go through each scenario, I'll try to kind of describe at least a little bit about what it is that the card actually means, and what the actual like content actually like would end up producing from an attack perspective and defense. All right, so Backdoors and Breaches. So our goal is to solve a full attack chain. Think of it like Dungeons and Dragons to an extent, where you have a dungeon master, which in this case you have an incident master who has a narrative that they want to play out. And the way that you would start the game is you would randomize these four different types of cards. You have Initial Compromise, Pivot and Escalate, C2 and Exfil, and then Persistence. You randomize them, and then you draw from each stack. And essentially what that does is it builds an attack chain from beginning of attack all the way up through Persistence and Data Exfil. And the Incident Master gets to see this. So like, if I was your Incident Master, I would get to see these. I know what the entire attack chain is, and I would start to build out a scenario around what you're going to solve. And it could start out with anything. It could be like, so-and-so got a phishing email and they reported it, right? And did anyone else get that phishing email? And you could start it kind of that way, right? And go through your incident response process. And on the incident responder side, you have a set of procedure cards. So a lot of these are very just standard things, such as firewall log review, server analysis. We added 2 new cards to the cloud deck that are specific to cloud events. So we added cloud event log analysis and permissions audits. And both of those are tied to trying to identify various attack pieces that are just specifically cloud related. So whenever it's the incident responder's turn, they would pick a card. They would say, oh, well, they got a phishing email. Let's maybe look at their endpoint, right? Let's do some endpoint analysis. And so you play the procedure card, and then you roll a dice, a D20. And if you get higher than 10, your procedure was successful. If you get less than 10, you failed. And effectively, you have 10 turns to solve an incident. And and so then we have a scenario start. So our scenario for today, like I said, business email compromise, right? So scenario for today that I kind of laid out is Bob from HR reports that he clicked a link from an email and logged into his account. He now thinks that it may have been suspicious. Okay, so that's our starting point, right? So now, what's the first step? What's the very first thing that you would do? Hearing that Bob and HR probably logged into some sort of weird website, right? And we got to solve this first link in the attack chain.
Bo,
so
just want to set, if I could just set the stage for those out there too. So think as Bo's doing this, if you guys have any, customers that maybe are co-managed, like just think about how sticky this could get in terms of your relationship with them. So imagine Bo's on your team and you talk to your co-managed team and go, hey, we want to work through something with you, like as a team, like, we do a lot of your, tier 2, tier 3, or whatever you're doing for them. Does that make some sense to you all? Because this is really a piece that I think a lot of MSPs could do very effectively and start to kind of elevate the relationship. And then go, hey, again, how would this have affected at the end? If this indeed happened, how would this affected, the processes, the revenue, really what the business cares about? Is that a fair statement, Bo?
Yeah, absolutely. 100%. 100%.
All right, go ahead.
Yeah. So like I said, the narrative wise, like I kind of just, crafted the procedure cards around what kind of solves this whole thing so that we're not sitting here for, a couple hours, right? Trying to solve an attack chain. So our first link in the attack chain, we're going to try using the user entity and behavior analytics procedure card, because we know that they probably gave their cred up to somebody, and maybe we should check to see if there's any sort of weird concurrent logins going on, right? And it looks like we've got multiple geographic regions all logging into the same account now. That's strange. All right, so that flips our initial compromise card. So our initial compromise, misconfigured MFA. Okay, this is a weird one, right? Like the organization deployed multi-factor authentication, right? So they did a good thing, right? Across all their cloud services. However, they misconfigured certain protocols that allowed the attackers to authenticate with a single factor. So Bob and HR gave their cred to somebody, right? They took that cred and, probably were blocked logging into maybe Outlook, right? The main login portals. However, due to certain issues with things like conditional access, which is something that comes up all the time on pen tests we do, we were able to find another place they could authenticate. Now, in Azure, Microsoft 365, there are multiple APIs you can log into. So there's the service management API, there's a graph management API. There are legacy auth protocols, things like Exchange Web Services, SMTP, ActiveSync. You have the ability to log in to these multiple places using the same set of credentials. And if there are conditional access policies built around those that are different, whereas maybe you had like a CEO who wanted to log. Oh yeah, it's Intra now. Thanks, Mike. I that's right. Can't call it Azure anymore. It's Microsoft Intra now. So we see that there was an interesting login happening, single factor from a different geographic region. So let's talk about conditional access for just a bit. So conditional access policies, these are fine-grained ways that you can apply MFA to certain scenarios. So for like one of the more common examples is you have C-suite members that maybe they don't want single factor on their phone, right? Like that's something that comes up pretty often. Their mobile device, they're tired of using 2FA on their mobile device, and they demand single factor. That happens quite a bit. So you can create a conditional access policy that says, all right, well, here's C-suite. You're allowed to log in single factor from your mobile devices. And one way you do that is by setting a device platform as the method for authenticating single factor. Now, the thing that conditional access policies actually look at when it determines device platform is literally just a user agent, though, right? So that's something that we can actually change very easily, right? A user agent can be faked, and it's actually very easy to do with a web browser. So, like in this example here, I've got two screenshots of a web browser, right? The one on the left is me authenticating to an account with MFA, just using a standard Edge browser, right? On the right, it's the exact same authentication, exact same username and password, except I changed the user agent with DevTools to an Android user agent. And in doing so, was able to authenticate without MFA, right? Not showing my screen. Is
See it. You're fine.
okay.
I'm not sure, Dennis, what might be going on. We see it.
Yeah, I see
Yeah,
it.
so this is something that like I've seen on multiple pen tests, and it's something like you know, out from the outside, or you might not think that it's something that somebody would find, right? It's not something super easy. But from my perspective as a pen tester, there's a few things that we end up doing. One, password spray, right? Like as you saw in the Verizon data breach report, right? Credential harvesting, creds were like the #1 method for entry into organizations, right? And that comes from a few different angles. So first off, password spraying, right? Where we're trying one, you know, like season and year or company name 123, those types of passwords across every single account in the environment, right? And oftentimes we'll get one or two, maybe. And that's an initial entry point, right? Like that gets us at least the first step. And then in those events where we get a credential like that, we can see that it's still a valid credential, even if MFA is in play, right? So let's say that, you know, we were spraying against Azure and you have MFA on that specific API, or spraying against just the Microsoft Online portal itself, and we see that MFA is there. We can determine if a cred is still valid or not. And in doing so, we can take that cred and then we can try it against all the other places where you might have a conditional access policy that allows single factor access, right? And I ended up writing a tool called MFA Sweep that does exactly that. Basically, it takes username and password and then sprays it against every single one that I'm aware of, Microsoft endpoint, to try to determine if any of those allow for single factor access. And oftentimes we'll find one that's, you know, just literally logging in with a mobile user agent lets you in single factor. Yep, go ahead, Andrew.
Yeah, but what just percentage wise, because season and year are so common. Just humor us with a percentage wise, how often that works for you, though.
So I would say it's gone down with how Azure and Microsoft 365 have started eliminating certain keywords. So 5 to 10 years ago, like when everyone just had on-prem AD and we're leveraging, you know, OA, right, for exchange for email, that was still hosted on-prem on an Exchange server. Whenever you had on-prem AD, season year was way higher, and I would say like 95 to almost 100% of organizations, we could probably get a season year credential at an organization through spraying. Now, though, I would say that that number's gone way down on the season and year front, purely because Microsoft already eliminates the ability for you to create a password with season anymore. Yeah. So if you have like an Azure Microsoft 365 tenant, they already eliminate the ability for you to create season year as a password.
Well, and that's as a obviously offensive guy. If you're a true threat actor, you're just going to go to initial access broker route any probably way and don't have to worry about really what the season and year are. You're just going to get the real data from an access broker.
Yeah, I mean, so I would say that, yeah, that's probably like accurate for sure. When it comes to like pen testing, right? Like we can't do that. Like we can't go buy creds off the black market.
Yeah.
But yeah, so so not if they have AD syncing 365 and don't have Azure AD password protecting. Exactly. Yeah. So if you're still leveraging on-prem AD for managing password policy, right? And you're syncing to Azure and not allowing password reset through Azure, then yes, then you still have that potential problem, right? Because every cred is still being bound to the internal policies. And there are password filters internally too, and we actually wrote one at Black Hills years ago. It was nothing like crazy or anything, but now there are products, right, that do password filtering on internal AD as well. But that's one of the bigger defenses. Actually, Andrew, we were talking about it yesterday. One of the bigger defenses to spraying is Microsoft 365's password protection.
Right.
That's literally what it's called. Azure AD, well, it's probably Intra now, Intra ID password protection. And effectively what it is, it's a password filter that prevents your users from picking certain words that you don't want them to pick. So if you go in and you say, you're not allowed to pick anything with seasons, anything with months, anything with sports teams, like local sports teams is another really big one, or company name. A lot of the more common things, you can prevent so much from the password spray front that it's like, it makes it so much harder for sure.
Yeah, just asking if anyone's using that in their, to help their their customers, mitigate those types of things. We'll see what they say in chat. Go ahead. Sorry, Beau, please continue.
All right, so we solved one piece, right? So we know misconfigured MFA is the initial access point, right? Somebody got a cred through phishing, our HR guy. There was MFA in most places, but there was one place that it wasn't. All right, so let's check out the second link. So we know the attacker was successful at phishing our employee, but what else did they do? So let's figure out if that account was used to do anything else interesting. So start looking at cloud event logs. And cloud event logs can be they can be very useful, but also, as we learned from the latest Chinese threat actor attack, that sometimes you have to pay a bit more to actually get the logs you want. So I again, like I haven't confirmed this for to the actual organization, but I saw a guy tweeted that he worked at IR for one of the organizations that was reported to as being compromised by the Chinese threat actor yesterday. And basically they didn't have visibility in the logs because the E3 licensing didn't provide the right logs that they needed. They needed to have E5, basically, is the way they made it sound. So so sometimes logs don't have what you want, or you might not be paying enough to get the right logs. However, we're gonna solve our pivot and escalate card now with search and pillage emails. Okay, so it seems we might have a business email compromise on our hands, right? The attackers search through a user's inbox for sensitive items like passwords, secrets, certificates. They find credentials that allow them to access other services such as applications or VPNs. This is something that I would say the entire time I've been pen testing, it's something we've been trying to do. And it's something that has never gone away. Like business email compromise, like, yes, it's super popular now too. But it's not new by any sense. Like it's been around for a long time. And the reason is because people like to send sensitive stuff in email for whatever reason. I mean, you've got Teams now too, right? Like you've got various chat mechanisms, but email still is at the heart of the majority of conversation. And there's been multiple engagements I've been on where we're external, we password spray somebody, we get into their email just like this, and search for things like passwords, search for things like certificates. There's a time that I was doing a red team against an organization that had 802.1x cert-based auth on their VPN. So you had to have the certificate to actually authenticate to their VPN. And we had sprayed like probably 30 different people password-wise on Outlook, right? And so we had access to email, which is a start, right? But we didn't actually get internal access until we started searching through their email, just like this, pillaging, and ended up finding that one of the employees actually had the certificate emailed to them. And so the email was in their inbox. And so all we had to do was download this 802.1x cert, install it on our VM, and then we're able to VPN in to the organization. So that's, another common thing, right? And by looking at our cloud event logs, we were able to see that the business or that the attacker was able to search their emails as well. So back in 2016, I wrote a tool called Mail Sniper. Back then, we really wanted to have this capability from an automated standpoint where we could search through everyone's email from an API perspective. And instead of going into like Outlook Web Access back then, and then using the built-in search functionalities or current modern day Outlook.com, and then using the built-in search functionalities. So ended up writing this tool to search through mailboxes. It still works with Microsoft 365 now too. But basically the gist is that, mailboxes tend to have sensitive data. This is a tool that can help do it. Another big key point here, one big thing that I really like to make sure people are aware of is that as a user of Outlook, doesn't matter who you are, as a user of Outlook, you can give permissions to anybody else within your organization to read your email. So this is something that a lot of people don't really understand as like a capability. So like me as just a regular person in HR or finance department or accounting or even the CEO of the company, I can literally give access to everyone at the company to read my email. And it's something that happens, and it's something that we look for now. So this is how easy it is. Basically in Outlook, if you right click inbox and click properties, you get this little properties box. And then there's a permissions tab. And by default, this default option here is there, and it says none, permission level none. And that means nobody can read your email. The default group, though, is effectively like domain users. It's literally everyone at the organization. So if you change that to literally anything else besides none, then everyone at the company can read your email. And it's something that so we've done, hundreds of pen tests, right, over the last 10 years that I've been here. And every single time I check this, there's like somewhere between 20 and 50 users at an organization that have opened their inbox wide to everybody. And sometimes it's like the CEO, right? Sometimes it's like the CEO of the company literally has their inbox wide open. And so this is another thing that we check with Mail Sniper now too. So let's see, they'd be bored to tears if they got my email. Yeah, I mean, so a lot of people think that, right? But every once in a while there's something interesting there. And in this case, this kind of fits that pivot mold, right? Because this gives you like a very clear example of where somebody in HR gets compromised. Maybe they don't have access to do something interesting, but in getting access to their email and their credential, and then trying to access other people at the organization's inboxes, we found some other interesting access.
Well, really common to see, I know one company in particular, really common to see executives having EAs, right? The executives traveling around a lot, and the EAs handling a lot of their email. Very common, again, that, executive doesn't think about, I could have some of the most sensitive information flowing in my email box.
Oh yeah.
Contracts, M&A, you name it, right? And then where you also see it commonplace that a lot of companies do is when new hires start for probationary periods, they'll do it so that the person that's, their manager can see what that person's writing and saying and doing as well. And then they forget to turn it off because, again, we're so great, I'm joking, at account hygiene, right?
Yeah, and then also, keep in mind, password resets and MFA tokens that get emailed to you. That's another like entry point, right? So, so imagine, I get access to, let's say, somebody in IT's inbox, right? And I trigger a password reset that gets emailed to that inbox that I now have access to purely because I can read their email, right? And I can click that link from their email and then potentially to reset the password that way.
Yeah, absolutely. Chip, you've seen a lot of that type of activity, correct? As well, over the years. I don't know if Chip's with us or
I'm with you. I was just on mute. Yeah, we have. I mean, we see it weekly.
Yeah. Cool. Ben, you can share it with me.
Right, that's cool.
All right, so far we know that the attacker phished an employee. They got access to their email, maybe others, right? Maybe others. We killed the attacker's session, and then we reset the user's password, right? Did some decent kind of cleanup there, but we're still seeing some abnormal cloud logs coming from one of our containers. All right, so we use Azure for maybe, multiple different services. Obviously, Microsoft 365 is one of them. We have some containers too. Now let's try to dig into these containers with some endpoint analysis. We're going to look at the containers themselves and see if there's anything interesting going on from a container perspective. And we find that this actually flips our persistence card. So looking at the container revealed that the attacker managed to install a backdoor that gets executed every time the container is run. So this is more of like a privileged activity, right? So this is not something that somebody in HR should really have access to do, which kind of insinuates that maybe they escalated privileges somehow. So this is something that it's such an interesting kind of way to create a backdoor into an environment, because containers are something that get run just on occasion, right? It's not something that's constantly running. There are these packages of software. So if you've ever used something like Docker or Kubernetes, you've used containers. So containers are these small containerized environments that they're basically virtual operating systems, right? You can package up an entire Linux environment into a container, an entire Windows environment into a container, and then trigger it when necessary. They can run, they get run for multiple different types of applications. A lot of cloud services now natively just run containers. So things like Azure App Services. So if you use like a web application on Azure, they leverage Docker on the back end just to basically spin up that website whenever you need it, but not necessarily keep it running all the time. And with the right permissions, you can actually backdoor these. They're called task definition files that are associated with containers. And effectively, whenever they get run, they would beacon out or perform some sort of action that give you that persistence to the container. So let's find this final link in our attack chain now. So we know that the employee from HR doesn't have access to modified containers, so the attacker must have pivoted to another account somehow, right? So let's take a look at the SIM. We've got a SIM too. Maybe there's some logs there that we missed. Maybe it had some alerts that we, possibly might lead us towards the final step in our attack chain here, which is C2 and exfil, right? We haven't actually seen what our C2 and exfil card is yet. And it reveals that the same IP was used to authenticate to another of our accounts, and it was an admin. And it turns out that they actually used the Azure portal itself to access a virtual machine. Now, this could kind of like tie into two different scenarios. The one that I'm kind of playing with here is that an admin was compromised, and they used the Azure portal to use a virtual machine to actually access the container environments. But then you could also look at this from the perspective of if you're using something like Azure Virtual Desktop, right, which is like the VDI service from Azure, right? A lot of organizations have started using that to run just their standard Windows environments from a virtualized perspective. But in any case, we did find that the admin account was used to log into the Azure portal and use the VM to access the container environment. So this is something that I actually had a customer that's really concerned about this a few weeks ago. And they had me kind of play out this scenario exactly like this, where effectively what they wanted to see is if you got access to the Azure portal, which as pretty much any administrative user, right, you can access subscriptions and resources through the Azure portal, which is just portal.azure.com. And they wanted to see, can you actually compromise the container environment, which is what the scenario kind of plays out. And basically what they did is it gave me access to the portal where if you've ever seen in the Azure portal and go to the virtual machines, you can actually see where you can run commands natively through the portal itself on virtual machines. So you don't even have to have like RDP access or SSH access or even like any sort of shell on the actual VMs. Through the Azure portal itself directly, you can actually issue commands, and they get run as system on Windows or root on Linux. So this is what it looks like on the left here. If you log into the Azure portal, go to a virtual machine page, and then go down to run command script, you can execute PowerShell or Bash scripts on virtual machines. So on the PowerShell side, it would look something like this, right? Where you run, you can run multiple commands like whoami ipconfig. You could run a script that actually creates some sort of C2 through this. And like I said, like this is something that the organization I was working with wanted to see how far you could go from here to compromise the container environment. So ended up giving me this level of access. One thing that I found that was actually pretty limiting about this particular function of Azure is that it's limited by 4,096 bytes to each command, and it takes like 20 seconds to run a command. So it's very, very difficult to do anything useful in a quick period of time, unless you just script out a bunch of commands, right? Let's see. Ben says, I was shocked when I saw that an ordinal user was able to see what was going on in the portal.azure.com. Luckily, you can put in things in place to remove that access. Yep, exactly. Yeah. So by default, every Azure Active Directory user can access the portal, right? What they can see in the portal is going to be limited depending on their access to certain subscriptions, right? So by default, they can see things like the directory. They can see users, groups. They can see some security settings, some user security settings. So things like, can you create security groups? Can you invite guests to the tenant? So they can see some things like that, which can be useful, but you can't actually lock that down. There's a setting in user settings that is just admin access to Azure Active Directory. And you can just check that checkbox to remove access from the rest of your user base, basically. But yeah, it's super useful as an attacker. Like I would say, like that's probably one of the first places I would go to look after getting a credential, right? Email's definitely a good first step too, right? Like if you phish somebody, get access to their email, that's great and all, but getting access to the portal is a really interesting first step because it gives you the immediate visibility into whether or not you can interact with resources within a subscription, just like this. Yep, Andrew. Oh, I don't know if Andrew, you there? Are you raising your hand? Trying to. Okay, sorry. So like as an attacker who compromises a credential, there's really two important things I want to understand right off the bat. One, can I access their email, right? That's by far, like that's the most general thing that happens, right? Because pretty much every employee at an organization tends to have access to email, and through that also get access to things like SharePoint, Teams messaging, OneDrive, whatever else on the Microsoft 365 service side. But then more importantly, for me as an attacker, what I really want to know is, can I access infrastructure? Because if I can, that typically leads to much more in-depth compromise, right? So if, for example, the organization we're attacking leverages Azure infrastructure like virtual machines, storage services, databases, web apps, if we can interact with those at any level, it becomes really, really interesting for us. Oh, was there a question? Thought I heard somebody.
No, I think there's a little bit of reverberation.
Oh, okay.
But again, Bo, question for you. Obviously, you let me mute because this guy's
It's all good. Just jump in whenever you feel. Yeah, you can interrupt. We've solved the attack chain, right? Which is good. We like I said, like whenever you play this game, it tends to take a little bit longer because you have to roll dice, you fail, you have kind of discussion around what protections you would try, right? Or what detections, I should say, you would try for each step of it. But in our case, we were able to kind of solve this whole attack lifecycle. And I would say that this is a pretty common thing that I like. If you looked at, I don't know, maybe like a couple of our red team reports, this would be something that would be very close to maybe something we would do. First step would be something like phishing a user or password spraying. I would say like on the phishing side, we tend to go for credential harvesting more than trying to get shells these days. Like that's, over like by far, the biggest thing that I've seen change over the last few years is endpoint security protections getting so good that it's kind of driven us more towards trying to compromise cloud environments. because of the nature of just needing to get credentials, right?
But I mean, Beau, that's what the Verizon data breach report flat out shows completely.
Yeah.
And in talking to John, John Strand, obviously, who owns Black Hills, he flat out says EDRs have gotten good.
It has.
They're not. And so it's so much easier to just go for credentials. And then the other interesting thing about the Verizon data breach report was that people have gotten so good at socially engineering, they don't even need phishing anymore. The pretexting bypassed phishing this year as the #1 tactic. Just, I'll tell you what to do.
Yeah.
I don't need to phish you. I'll just tell you, do this, and you'll do it. One thing, that is common in compromise is that, people, I think, often think of like, it's this, event that just happens. And as you kind of articulated, Beau, it's a series of events that starts to stack one on top of another. And then, obviously the big things happen, right? And we have, as defenders, in essence, time. If we have good defensive measures in place and detective controls in place. My question to you is in what you've seen, coming in post-compromise, and then coming in doing a red team or pen test, for companies that have gotten business email compromise, because it was a smash and grab, it was relatively not kind of that entire kill chain that you just went through. Are there often further ramifications because of the supply chain that threat actors have? Like, in other words, hey, this was an easy BEC, but then you're seeing another compromise come in after for a threat actor to kind of go deeper. Like, is there a correlation to that, do you feel?
Yeah, I mean, so one of the big, I would say, like, advantages of just getting a single credential is the fact that you now have access to the full directory of users. So in terms of like a threat actor, right? From the outside, you have a few kind of, public tools that can kind of tell you a little bit about the employee base, right? Things like LinkedIn, right? Salesforce. Like, there's a lot of applications that we can kind of identify a few users at the organization. And, it varies between organizations, but I would say, like, in most cases, we maybe can identify like 30 to 40% of actual employees that work at an organization, right? So that's a relatively small number, right? But as soon as we get one credential, we now have access to the full employee base, right? So now I know 100% of who works at your company, right? And through that allows us to, one, craft, more phishing messages, right? Because we now have the full list, but also password attacks, right? Now we have 100% of user base to do password attacks against. We have a higher success rate in the future attacks, right? Because we now know everybody at the company. And I would say that, just based off of that initial access, you get so much information. Actually, that actually brings up a really good, interesting point of something that we started doing a few years ago, which is what we kind of considered a pre-phish. It's kind of what we were calling it, where we weren't necessarily trying to phish for credentials. We weren't trying to phish for payload execution in the context that we were trying to get a shell in somebody's system. What we're phishing for is information. And we ended up crafting certain like attacks where basically we could enumerate information, gather that information externally so that we could craft better attacks later. Right. So like, we would enumerate things like, what are all the services running on a computer, so that we know what EDR is there, what proxy services are in place, what's the password policies that are in place, and that, like, just knowing that those few things can help drive so much better phishing attacks in the future.
Yeah, it was, and to that point, I'm assuming, Chip, I'll kind of maybe ask you this: when you see threat actors in there and doing, mail forwarding rules, I'm just curious, have you seen over the years, let's just say I'm in there and I see all these emails, and I'll just randomly pick. I know that you guys use Blue Cross Blue Shield, and we're coming up for, the January timeframe. Like, true or false, right? I can now craft something very, seemingly real,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah,
They're
absolutely.
very targeted with an event that everyone knows is coming up. I mean, what happens is you're talking about impersonation, right? You're now able to impersonate someone's identity because first off, whoever looks at their sent email, almost never. And with email communications, it's asynchronous and you're generally not on screen with someone. So there's a lot of stuff that we transact in our day-to-day lives that we're just assuming that the person behind this, this sent label in our email is actually the person who we think it is. And we do have trust because we interact with, especially in intra-company, we interact with each other all the time. So you wouldn't think for a second that, in our case, Tracy, our HR coordinator, sends us all an update to log in for exactly that, Andrew, like a medical insurance renewal. Well, we would all think that that's perfectly normal for Tracy to do. So you're exactly right. But, I want to highlight what Beau was saying. This comes back to the sequence of events. And what we've seen in our data now over the last 2.5 years, 3 years, is this starts all the way back to things Beau was talking about. First, it's directory harvest attacks. We got to figure out what's the way that this company uses as a format for their email addresses. And, a simple thing that companies can do is don't use the same format. Don't go with first letter dot last name for every single person in the environment. So just start right there. But we see that directory harvest attack. Then we see password spray attacks. Then you start seeing account locks. Like you can see, sound like I'm beating a drum, but we see this over and over again. The pattern escalates until finally one person gets compromised in the environment. And after that, that's when you start seeing the signature of the business email compromise, the rule set up for Outlook, the SMPT forwarding, all those things start happening. But there is always an escalation.
Yeah. And that's the beating this dead horse, Chip, is that it's not just this explosion event. There's these little micro events that happen along the way, and then they get what they need.
Yep.
So
and they're super noisy, by the way, those events.
Yeah.
Like password spray attack is unbelievably noisy on somebody's domain. Which is, so we don't, SaaS doesn't surface all of those events, but we do surface, okay, you've had a bunch of lockouts now in a row. So now you need to pay attention to that and make sure that your configuration settings for that tenant are up to snuff because someone's really, really digging in.
Yeah. I think back to the whole credential thing, and I forget the exact, I'm paraphrasing, but the beginning of the Verizon data breach report was basically like how, disheartened they were by the fact that it was basically this people using the threat actors using tried and true stuff. It's nothing like that. That was their message, that out of all these compromises, like almost, and I'm joking, it was a letdown because all we were doing is using the stuff that's working forever.
Yeah, if you've ever heard John Strain talk about it, he calls those forever days, right? They're
Yeah.
not 0 days, they're forever days.
Right.
Vulnerabilities that basically, like, they're not necessarily like a vulnerability in the same context as like an exploitable vulnerability, but they're things that we take advantage of all the time. Password spraying, phishing, forever days, right?
Yeah. I mean, I gotta believe you guys have 100% hit rate, Beau, in some way, shape, or form to get into an organization with tried.
It's tougher, right? And like I said, like access to has, I guess, like that has been, the line has been blurred in terms of getting in, right? Like getting into somebody's cloud accounts, 100% for sure.
Right.
Getting into an on-prem environment, it's gone down a lot.
Yeah. But that's just the point, is that's why we see BEC through the roof.
Mm-hmm.
Because
Absolutely.
Why do I want to go through all that effort when I can just go tell you what to do? Go wire the money this way or that way. So this was fantastic. Jim, I know we got a few minutes left here. And you probably have had a few sips of bourbon because of all those rolls coming up on 20s.
I wish. Yeah. So no, this has been phenomenal. And Beau, we really appreciate you coming on and doing this for our community here. It's critically important and certainly supports our mission here at SaaS Alerts.
Awesome. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, Jim, and a little purview, right? You're going to have Beau working with Chip in your pre-day, aren't you?
Yes, Right a Boom, the best security conference in the world for MSPs. We will be a platinum sponsor, and we will be on stage. Well, I won't be. I'm not smart enough to be on stage with Beau, but Chip will be on stage with Beau at our pre-day for Right a Boom.
Humbly. And Andrew, was that a Freudian slip? You said purview. Did you mean you meant preview, but you actually said purview? You have Microsoft on the brain?
Yeah, probably was. Probably was. Well, this is great. I really appreciate, Beau, you coming out. I really appreciate what a great turnout we had. I think we peaked at around 76, 77, something like that. So that's a record, Jim, for a SaaS Alerts call.
It is. It's a record.
Let's break it next week with second installment of Beau.
Yeah, exactly. Now that everyone knows that Beau's doing this for 2 more times, like we should double and triple it for the following weeks.
Tell folks in your peer group, please invite them. It's critically important that they hear, what's going on, and then use this tool, the Backdoors and Breaches cloud, to help your customers. Like I said, get more sticky with them. So, Jim, we're right at the top of the hour. So we want to close this out.
Thank you all. This is awesome information. Information is power, and it's all free here on the community calls. So take advantage of it.
Awesome. We'll see you next Thursday. Take care, everybody. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Beau. Thanks, everybody.
Bye.
Thanks, Beau. Thanks, Chip. Thanks, Michelle. Take care, everybody.